Hello. There are countless history videos on the internet right now about basically every subject. But there are a few subjects that I really don't see any content about. One of them is the history of specific cities in the United States. And I thought the history of the city of Phoenix was actually quite interesting and a little bit underrated. And kind of the whole history of Arizona is it's not as fun as something like World War II, but it is still interesting. It has a lot of fun characters in it. So I thought the founding of the city would be an interesting story to talk about. All right, let's get started.
The year is 1862 in the New Mexico Territory of the United States, and a man from South Carolina named Jack Swilling has just deserted the Confederate Army. Wait, what? Alright, let's get some context first. The Salt River Valley is a 500 square mile or 1,300 square kilometer section of land which sits north of the modern Mexican border and east of California. It sits in the middle of the eastern half of the Sonoran Desert and is home to two notable rivers, the Gila River and the Salt River. These rivers are given water by the streams coming from the mountains and plateaus of the northeast, which make up part of the Rocky Mountains. These two rivers produce a surprising amount of water and help give the desert of the Salt River Valley some really needed moisture, but they don't make it a green, fertile valley, obviously. In order to understand the Salt River Valley fully, we have to first understand the Hohokam people that were the first to build a complex society in it. Amerindians had been traveling through the valley since they had been on the continent, but very few people ever really settled in the valley. The Hohokam people are speculated to have been originally from Mexico and had migrated north up into the valley. They probably saw the two rivers and decided to settle down there. These people at some point started digging gigantic canals from the rivers to expand the amount of fertile land they had to grow food on. And as time went by, their society became more complex and their settlements grew and the canals spread throughout the entire valley. It's kind of like a knockoff version of ancient Egypt, with the Salt and Gila rivers being like the Nile, just without the sea access or the crocodiles. What is really interesting is I read that at some point the wealth inequality between the poor and rich in Hohokam society became so stressful for people that some really major issues popped up, and there was possibly a lot of killing of each other. That's speculation. What matters to our story is that at some point in the 1500s, drought and environmental shifts, and possibly the violence I mentioned, led to the Hohokam society being utterly destroyed and their culture being almost wiped out. There are descendants of these people still today, but they don't have really any memory of how their ancestors met their demise. All that was left from the fall of the Hohokam was their artifacts and their gigantic canal networks that span the entire valley.
Fast forwarding through the Spanish and Mexican eras, where the valley saw very little development and remained largely unsettled, the early 1800s in particular saw a steady decline in the overall population of the Arizona area because of disease and conflict. The Apache people in particular were really relentless in their raiding of both Amerindian tribes and settled Mexicans. And once Americans came to Arizona and New Mexico, the Apache just came to raiding them as well. Famous Apache leaders and chiefs, like a man named Cochise and an excellent warrior named Mangus Coloradus, came into the scene around where the story really starts in 1860. Cochise is definitely a crazy character, and he's got a whole story of his own, but Mangus Coloradus is far more interesting to me personally. From what I've read and listened to, he isn't as bloodthirsty as many of the other Apaches like Cochise were at the time. He really only started participating in the raids against all the people in the area when a group he was in was ambushed by American miners, and I can only assume he wanted revenge after that. The story that really gets me about Mongus Coloradus is that after he survived getting shot in the chest by a musket, he actually went to negotiate with the American military for some kind of peace agreement, despite what all the other Apache wanted. His whole story really makes him seem like this tired old warrior that's really ready to put all the killing behind him and find some common ground with the people he's been fighting instead. Unfortunately, Mongus Coloradus was captured during his attempt to talk to the American army, and they killed him and then boiled his head so they could remove his skull and compare it with other skulls. So I guess the lesson here is sometimes it doesn't go how you want it. And sometimes you probably shouldn't lower your guard around people who were shooting at you 3 seconds ago. Okay, now to the main point. In 1860, the U.S. was moments away from the Civil War, and things were changing rapidly. Americans were trickling into the Salt River Valley looking for work and mainly mining opportunities. There were mines for all kinds of metals opening up in the area, and despite the seemingly never-ending violence, wealth and prosperity were growing in the territory. This is when the two main characters of our story enter the picture: Jack Swilling and Darrell Duppa. Jack Swilling is exactly the kind of name you would expect from this time period, but his first name was really John, but that's not how we know him. We know him as Jack. Jack Swilling was a poor man from the Deep South who had a drug and alcohol problem. He had a cracked skull and a bullet lodged in his back from a bad fight he got into when he was young. At some point, he left his family to find good money in the western deserts, and all his letters to his wife all say that he's going to be back the next year. He'll be back any moment now, guys, any moment. But he never comes back, and his wife just assumes he's dead after she stops seeing his letters. In 1860, Jack joined the militia in the area called the Gila Rangers and became its captain at one point. The Gila Rangers' main purpose was to fend off the Apache raids that kept happening, and he really got to know the area and the people who lived in it when he was in this group. Then after some shenanigans with gold mining and leaving the Gila Rangers, Jack saw the beginning of the Civil War in 1861. Jack Swilling's involvement in the Civil War is interesting, but the details are pretty spotty, so instead we'll do a quick montage. At the start of the war, Jack was in a place called Pintos Altos. The men of Pintos Altos organized a militia, and Jack Swilling was made a lieutenant in it because of his time in the Gila Rangers. When the Confederate Army arrived in the area of Pintos Altos, the group was pressed into their military and made to switch sides from the Union. Jack and his company then went with the Confederate Army and marched on Tucson, where the city opened its gates to them. He and his men possibly fought Union soldiers coming from California as well, and they captured a notable captain who Jack Swilling became friends with eventually. When the Confederates lost a major battle in New Mexico, they were forced to retreat east with basically no supplies, and so they ordered Jack Swilling and his men to confiscate supplies from the locals in New Mexico. But he absolutely refused, because these were the same people he had been protecting from Apache raids for the past few years. So this fallout with the Confederate officers led him to just abandoning the Southern Army and fending out for himself. He later briefly became a scout for the Union Army, but largely his time in the Civil War ended at this point. A fun fact I thought was cool was that Jack would later be a part of the group of men that ambushed and captured Mongus Coloradus when Mongus Coloradus was trying to make peace, which later led to his death. So yeah, I mean, it's still sad, but it's cool that Jack Swilling was a part of that. By 1863, Jack Swilling had left the military and went back to gold mining and other entrepreneurial ventures in Arizona. He had made many friends at this point who would work with him in looking for business opportunities all over the area. Essentially, they were a gang of Americans roaming around building buildings and investing in various things. And because the year is 1863, we have to introduce our second character, Philip Darrell Duppa. This guy is something else and is quite ridiculous. He has a fraction of the info written about him that Jack Swilling does, but what we do have about him raises more questions than it answers. He's an Englishman who was born in France and went to Cambridge University. He was a well-educated European man who knew at least 5 different languages and had studied all kinds of literature, which is a complete contrast to our poor Jack Swilling, who surprised me when I found out he was even literate. Darrell Duppa's story all comes from what he said about himself when he got to the US. According to him, he got shipwrecked one day in South America, who knows where, and he wandered around the New World for who knows how long, until he eventually turned up in Prescott, Arizona in 1863. Duppa met Jack Swilling and his friends at some point, and they became business partners immediately. Darrell Duppa had a British accent, which the others found funny, so they called him Lord Duppa, which is just amazing. In 1867, after some business adventures, and also Jack Swilling getting married to a Spanish woman, now that he realized he would never go back east to his old family, unfortunately, the gang came back to the Salt River Valley for more opportunities. There was a small camp in the area called Hay Camp, which was founded by a Californian whose name was literally John Smith. At this camp, Jack gained an appreciation for the agricultural potential of the region when he saw how easy it was to divert the Salt River into the ancient canals. I can just imagine when he saw the water going into those old canals, he must have had the largest light bulb moment over his head. Jack then went to the mining town of Wickenburg and founded the Swilling Canal Company. With $10,000 in hand and a bunch of mules, they set out to digging, restoring, and modernizing the old Hohokam canals. Their project attracted farmers and agricultural workers from all over the country who saw the potential of the irrigated land now that was covering the area. As time went by, the gang made more and more money as the community around the canals grew. Eventually, the community would get its own store and post office, changing it into a defined town on the map. When the community was still small and rapidly growing, Swilling, Duppa, and the gang all debated on what the name of the place would be. Jack Swilling, despite not being all that sympathetic to the old Confederate cause, especially after he had unceremoniously departed from their army in the middle of the desert, by the way, the army that he was forced to be in to begin with, he still wanted the new community to be named Stonewall after the brilliant dead Confederate general named Stonewall Jackson. This didn't go well with the others. They didn't really want to be named after a Confederate general. One of the men with them named Jack Starr suggested that the name Salina be chosen, but one of the other men shot it down because it technically meant salt marsh, and it seemed off-putting. Darrell Duppa then proposed the name Phoenix, due to the new town growing from the now dead Hohokam civilization. Because he had been educated in the classics, Darrell Duppa knew of the Greek myth of the phoenix rising from the ashes after being mortally wounded. The city would be the phoenix of civilization rising from the ashes after it was destroyed. Pretty neat. The men agreed to the name, and by 1868 the name was already in use in newspapers in places like Prescott. On a completely unrelated note, right after this, apparently a man named Cooper drowned in the river and possibly one of the canals. Probably not something I should find funny, but I do think drowning in the desert is pretty funny. So, anyways. In later years, Jack and Duppa would fall out with each other over where the city center would be located. Eventually, Darrell Duppa would win out in this contest, and he would play a large part in founding many key parts of Phoenix. And he would later die in 1890 as one of its founders. Jack Swilling's situation was less rosy. He had made a lot of money, and he had built some significant buildings for himself, especially a house that he would live in.
But his pain from his cracked skull and the bullet wounds that had never healed were catching up with his health, and his bad drinking and drug habits weren't helping. His death is an entire story of its own. It's this whole story about him being framed for robbing a stagecoach after he went out to try and bury an old friend that had been killed in an Apache raid. And he claimed that he was doing a Christian thing, and then they were framing him for doing something evil that he would never do. It's this whole story. But what matters is that he eventually ended up in jail, where he was removed from his medicine, but also his alcohol and his drugs. So he went into horrible withdrawal. And this withdrawal basically killed him when he left the cell. The city of Phoenix would later grow to become the capital of the state of Arizona in 1912. And it would become far greater than any of these men would have even predicted. But that is a story for another time. I hope you learned something. I enjoyed making this, so I'll probably make similar stuff in the future. If you have any corrections for stuff you think I got wrong, then leave it in the comments. All right, thank you.